This is Democracy Watch. Mark, we have major news on pretty much the biggest story in the country right now, which is this idea that Elon Musk's Doge Commission has access to all Americans' sensitive data, including Social Security numbers, for example. A federal judge has finally stepped in. Can you explain what just happened?
Yeah, this is a blockbuster ruling from a federal judge in New York City who was asked on an emergency basis to block Doge's access to these very sensitive databases at the U.S. Treasury Department, not just to block Elon Musk's access, right? Some of the earlier cases we've talked about, there has been this kind of like parsing about whether Doge could still be in the Treasury Department, but it was read only and they couldn't write, or whether only the special government employees could have access to the information, but not others. What this judge did is said nobody from Doge can have access to these databases. Only career civil servants within the Treasury Department can have access to these databases, and that any materials or printouts or downloads of any information from these databases have to be destroyed by anyone associated with Doge who may have them. So this judge has really, at this point, put a complete halt on the infiltration, the exfiltration of data, the infiltration with personnel, the embedding of personnel into these databases that have personally identifying information like people's Social Security numbers. This is a big, bold order from a very good, experienced federal judge in New York City. It's only a temporary hold until the case can be ultimately heard on the merits and decided. That is true about all these cases we're hearing about, and no one should worry about that. That's how the system works, right? Is that first there's an emergency order and there's sort of a status quo put in place, and then the case is decided from there.
Mark, this might be the cynic in me coming out, but who is to say that they're actually going to comply with this order if any folks who would be in positions of oversight are already Trump lackeys? All the inspectors general have been fired. And so who is there to make sure that they comply?
Right. And so, look, you sound like the comments that we've gotten at Democracy Docket when Democracy Docket reported this, and you sound like my Blue Sky feed of people who say, great, Mark, but like, they're not going to comply. And yeah. I understand the skepticism, Brian, because, Mr. Big Balls, the one guy, and I don't remember, is he the neo-Nazi? There's one has sort of a Nazi problem.
When we can't remember which one is Big Balls and which one is the guy who wants to normalize Indian hate, I think that's when there's a general culture problem. I think that's indicative of a larger problem here.
Right. And of course, the vice president, with no other official duties to do, decided to weigh in favor of rehiring the guy in favor of Indian hate.
While he has to go home to his Indian American wife and his 3 Indian American kids. But I guess that's the cost of loyalty to Donald Trump.
Right. But so look, I understand the skepticism that people have here. But what I can tell you is that this federal judge, by issuing this order as quickly as he did, I mean, the state of New York and the other states that brought this lawsuit brought it on Friday, and by sort of early in the morning on Saturday, this order was already in place. And like I said, it is a very sweeping order. Anyone who is caught with those materials or where there is evidence that they did not destroy them will be subject to contempt of court, which can be quite serious. And the lawyers associated with it, they face problems if they don't make sure that their clients and that the executive branch knows this. Other employees in the Department of Justice, or in the Treasury Department could face problems. But this is in some sense the most sweeping action we have seen any judge take in any of the cases against Donald Trump and the whole dismantling of government since he became president.
So this was with regard to Treasury. We have seen Doge gain access into the Department of Labor, Doge gain access into a variety of other organizations. So is a ruling like this going to apply to other agencies, or do we just have to wait for those agencies to be harmed so that they have standing to go in and do the same thing? But really by then we're just kind of chasing after Doge as opposed to taking any proactive action against something that we all know that they're going to do anyway. So could this apply to other agencies even before Doge goes in? Or do we have to wait for Doge to kind of wreak havoc before we can do something about it?
Look, I think you've hit the nail on the head. So This order only applies to Treasury, but it speaks to a larger sort of norms and culture and expectations problem that we have, which it is good to see the judges are coming around on. Like, so to be clear, this is a big deal, this case in that journey. But let me explain it to you. So normally, when a federal judge has a lawsuit against the United States, against the president of the United States, against, cabinet officials, you can understand why they are typically skeptical of private litigants coming in and saying, we would like you to shut down the way in which the executive branch is operating in some key fashion. And when the Department of Justice lawyers show up in their courtrooms and say, look, Your Honor, we're operating according to what the president wants and what the Secretary of Treasury wants, and like, this is all above board, courts are normally predisposed to be like, okay, I've got the Department of Justice. They speak on behalf of the federal government. I've got cabinet officials, like in the normal course, they are not inclined to think the worst of what is going on. They assume that all things being equal, it is probably the private litigant who is on the wrong side, not the government who's on the wrong side. So what we have seen, though, over the course of just the last 7 days is a real attitude shift. Right? The first lawsuits that were filed, the courts were entering orders that you and I talked about that were being easily evaded. It was like a game of cat and mouse. They would issue an order and then the government would say, oh, well, we only assumed it applied to these people and not those people. And then we started to see the courts issue broader orders. We saw that order from a judge in Washington, D.C. about the OMB memo, who said, look, I don't care if it's an OMB memo. I don't care if it's a tweet from a press secretary. Like, it applies. My order prohibits you from defunding these grants in any fashion. And that was the first time we saw a federal judge really, like, the aha moment went off, that deference to the federal government is not going to work here, right? You need to do these broader orders. Here, we saw the judge do it off the bat and said, I'm going to apply this order to everyone other than career civil servants. If you are not a career civil servant, if you are part of Doge, hands off and you've got to destroy it. Now, I understand we are still on the journey that you are laying out. You're like, when can this just be prophylactic to the entire federal government? We're not there. Yeah. Would it surprise me if we start to get there next week? No, it wouldn't, because I think these federal judges are getting tired about two things. Number one, they are annoyed, undoubtedly, that they keep being told that there is an emergency that they have to rule on immediately. Judges have schedules like everybody else. They don't like having to set everything aside. And they definitely don't like having to set everything aside when it turns out that the government is consistently on the wrong side, right? Which is that the government keeps losing these emergency hearings. So what's happening is the judges are getting in their heads, like, I don't understand. This other judge told them to cut it out, and they're still doing it. And now it's interfering my docket. And so as this starts to snowball, I think you're going to start to get judges more and more annoyed with these and start to issue broader orders. The second part, though, Brian, and this is what we have to be on the lookout for. Are we starting to see cracks in the lawyers in the Department of Justice or in these agencies? I took note that in one of the hearings late last week, it was actually a very senior supervisor who argued the case. Now, that is highly unusual. You don't usually have senior lawyers in the Department of Justice in a supervisory role having to show up in court. And I'm starting to wonder, not that it's a good thing if you start to see resignations, not that it's a good thing if you start to see the good people, leaving, but I'm starting to see the early signs of the willingness of some government lawyers to fight these absurdly illegal fights. I'm starting to see that crack. And so I think a combination of those two things may come to a boiling point in the next 5 days, next 7 days. And I think you and I will then be doing an episode to talk about where we go from there, because that would be uncharted territory.
Well, Marc, isn't it true that for some of these lawyers who don't want to put their own jobs on the line, I mean, they can be predisposed to sanctions or even losing their law license if they're going to go in because they've been thrown to the wolves by the Trump administration, who frankly could care less if some disposable lawyer loses his law license, because there's going to be a line of other lawyers who are willing to take their place. But aren't some of these folks, I guess, deferring more to the longevity of their own career than looking to do something illegal for Trump?
I think that some of them are doing that. Some of them are looking out for the longevity of their career. I think some of them are also just dispirited by it.
Yeah.
I mean, you could be a DOJ lawyer for 5 years and argue cases regularly and never lose. I mean,
Right.
let's be honest. Like the DOJ usually wins their cases because,
Right.
like I
I
said,
think their success rate is something like 98 or 99%. And in
yeah,
fact, we've spoken at length about the fact that if anything, the DOJ is too timid to take an aggressive posture on some of these cases because they are so predisposed to only taking
right.
cases that they're guaranteed to win. And so when you have, Donald Trump engaging in the January 6th stuff or in the classified documents case, it takes so long because the natural predisposition is not to say, yeah, let's just go for it, even though it's not a home run.
No, that's exactly right. And I think that a lot of the criticisms we had about Merrick Garland and as you say in the January 6th prosecutions, also in the voting arena, the place that I litigate most, they were too timid for precisely the reasons you say. But I think that so part of it is I think these lawyers looking out for the longevity of their career, but part of it is also they are just shell shocked at the prospect of continuously going to court and being scolded. I mean,
Yeah.
these lawyers are having a rough go of it in front of these judges because the positions they are advocating. I mean, in a different case that involved USAID, you had a Trump appointed judge write an opinion that is like, there's a difference between putting someone on leave in Bethesda, Maryland, than putting them on leave in Syria. I mean, that doesn't sound like a big deal maybe to your audience, but that's a really biting and sharp retort for a career DOJ lawyer or any DOJ lawyer to hear from a federal judge, no less one appointed by Donald Trump. I think we may get to the point where we get to an inflection point where the courts become very, very irritated, much more aggressive in the scope of their orders. And the Department of Justice lawyers just look at themselves in the mirror and be like, what am I doing?
And finally, let's finish off with this. I'm cautiously feeling heartened about the prospect of the court actually doing what you for so long have said it would do, which is to serve as an effective bulwark against the worst excesses of the Trump administration. Does it look like, in fact, the court is able to stand up and do what, for example, Republicans in Congress won't do, which is to assert its authority, retain its autonomy, and uphold the law?
So the answer is yes, with an asterisk. Okay. So you and I have talked about this a lot. And I've said, the trial courts in this country, the federal district courts in this country are as good as they have been in a very long time. Joe Biden appointed a lot of judges. Some of the Trump judges, as we've seen, are not amused by these antics. Even a Ronald Reagan appointee in Washington State, as you recall, was, sort of read the riot act to DOJ over birthright citizenship.
Right.
Then you get to the courts of appeals, right, which we really haven't heard from yet. We haven't yet heard the D.C. Circuit or the Second Circuit or the First Circuit or the Fifth Circuit or any of those. We haven't heard them weigh in yet, right? That'll be the next thing. And I kind of think they'll hold. I think that, when you look at where these cases have been filed, they've been filed in Washington, D.C. The D.C. Circuit's pretty reasonable. The ones in Massachusetts go to the First Circuit. That's a fairly progressive circuit. The Second Circuit, New York, more mixed, but also a very smart circuit. So I kind of think things will hold there. But then the big wild card is, what does the Supreme Court do at that point?
Yeah.
And they have kind of three choices, Brian. One is they just say, what, not it. Like, what, we don't have to hear these cases. The lower courts are flooded with them. The lower courts are sorting them out. We, the Supreme Court, don't, at least not on an emergency basis, have to get involved. Maybe we'll hear a case for next term, in 2026, but we don't need to do anything now, right? It's already February. Our term ends in June. We're just going to let this be. That's option one. Option two is they actually want us to show solidarity with the lower courts, and they actually just summarily affirm these lower court decisions. I'm not, I didn't fall off a turnip truck. That is not the most likely outcome. The third is that a conservative majority of the Supreme Court decides they want to dive in. That would be such a terrible thing, not just substantively on the law, but also for the court's credibility. For the Chief Justice keeps talking about, there are no Democratic judges and Republican judges or justices, and, their ethics are perfect and all of that. This is working itself through the lower courts just fine. The Supreme Court doesn't need to be in a hurry to jump into these cases, and that would be my advice to them if they were to ever ask my advice, which they're not. But that is, of course, going to be the first test, and that will probably come in one of the birthright citizenship cases, just because those are a little bit further ahead. But, my advice to Chief Justice Roberts is tell his colleagues, no one needs to hear quickly from the U.S. Supreme Court in any of these cases.
Well, I know that you have been covering this relentlessly. Democracy Docket is where I get all of my news in terms of what happens in the courts and these court decisions, these monumental court decisions being handed down. So highly recommend for anybody watching, not just to hear about this stuff as soon as it breaks, but also to support Marc and his team, which is what we should be doing right now. Please make sure to sign up for Democracy Docket. I'll put the link right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
I'm Marc Elias.
This is Democracy Watch.